Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your questions, dig into the sources you send us, and really boil them down.
Get you the key insights, fast.
Exactly. Get you smart, quickly, and thoroughly. Today, we're plunging into a really fascinating piece. It's a Substack article by Jamie Horrocks, Ph.D.
Right, it's called Not the First, Not the Last, How Institutions Manufacture Legitimacy Through Expert-Led Containment.
Quite a title.
It is. And our mission today, based on what you, the listener, asked about, is really to understand how institutions might use these kinds of expert reports.
With the CAS review being the main example here.
Yeah, using that to see how they manage dissent, kind of keep things as they are, and also to spot if this pattern pops up elsewhere.
Right, because the article, it definitely focuses on the CAS review. That's the one looking into NHS gender identity services for kids and teens. But Horrocks argues pretty convincingly, I think, that this isn't just some isolated issue with one review.
No, it's presented as symptomatic, part of a much bigger systemic thing about how institutions work.
Okay, so let's dive in. The CAS review itself. What's the basic background we need?
Well, it was commissioned back in 2020. And you have to remember the context then. There was a lot of public anxiety, political discussion around trans youth.
Yeah, I remember the media was pretty intense.
Very critical media, yes. Legal challenges were happening around gender-affirming care, and generally just a rising tide of sort of anti-trans feeling.
And the review was positioned as what? Independent, evidence-based?
It was the framing, yes. Yeah. An unbiased, evidence-based evaluation.
And the goal was to come up with recommendations, right?
Yeah.
Which led to this more cautious approach that they talked about.
That's right. And the most high-profile outcome was probably the decision to essentially indefinitely pause puberty blockers for under 18s, unless they were part of a formal research trial.
Okay. And that had ripples beyond the UK.
Oh, definitely. Its influence has been, well, pretty significant. The CAS review started getting cited in U.S. court cases and state legislative debates.
Wow.
Yeah, it really shaped the international conversation around access to care.
But the article we're looking at pushes back on this. It highlights some pretty serious critiques of the review itself.
It does. It points specifically to a peer-reviewed analysis by Nooney and colleagues from 2025.
And what did they find, methodologically speaking?
They flagged several major issues. One big one was how the review used something called the GRADE framework.
Your grade.
Now, GRADE is, it's really designed for assessing evidence quality in clinical drug trials. That's its main job.
Right.
But the research landscape in gender care is much broader than that. You've got observational studies, you've got qualitative data, lived experience.
So using GRADE was like
using the wrong tool for the job. The article uses the analogy of trying to measure how soft a pillow is with a ruler.
Okay, I get it. It just doesn't fit. Weakens the whole assessment.
Exactly. It fundamentally mismatches the tool to the evidence.
What else did the critique find?
Well, Nooney's analysis also showed the CAS review excluded nearly half of the available studies it looked at initially.
Half. Why?
A lot were excluded because they weren't in English or they came from outside what they termed high-income settings.
That sounds like it could introduce some serious bias.
Absolutely. A big cultural and linguistic bias, which kind of undermines the claim that the conclusions are universally evidence-based.
Yeah.
And another thing Money et al. Pointed out was how quotes from trans young people were sometimes used.
How so?
Selectively. Sometimes taken out of context, used in ways that might imply doubt or instability, even if the original source material was actually quite affirming.
Okay, that does sound deeply troubling, sort of picking data to fit a narrative.
That's the concern raised, yes.
And then there's this other piece the article highlights.
Yeah.
Something that happened after the report came out.
Right, the timing. Just a few months after the final report was published, Dr. Cass, who led the review,
Yes.
she was appointed as a life peer to the House of Lords.
Wow.
Now, officially, it was framed as recognition for her broader career in pediatrics. But the author, Horrocks, suggests the political timing is, well, hard to ignore.
It definitely makes you pause, doesn't it? Getting elevated like that so soon after delivering a report that seemed to align pretty well with where the government wanted things to go. The article suggests this isn't just about the science, maybe, but about how certain findings get rewarded if they fit the agenda.
That's the implication drawn.
Which leads us nicely into this idea of the manufactured expert archetype. What does Horrocks mean by that?
It's presented as Dr. Cass being an example of a type, a recurring figure in these situations.
An archetype.
Yes. The article uses the metaphor liar for hire, but clarifies it's not necessarily about telling outright falsehoods.
Okay, so what is it about?
It's more about performing a specific role, using clinical detachment, fluency, and bureaucratic language.
To reach certain conclusions.
To deliver conclusions that seem neutral, objective, but which ultimately support the institution's interests, or the state's interests.
So the expert is usually credentialed, professional.
Definitely. And often external to the community being looked at, trained in systems thinking, interventionism.
And the key is how they frame the data.
Exactly. It's not always about making up data, but selecting, interpreting, framing what's there to support a particular outcome.
And Dr. Cass's background fits this.
The article argues yes. Her background in the traditional medical model, diagnostic hierarchies, risk management, procedures, inherently doesn't have much space for messy things like lived experience or relational autonomy.
And institutions actually value that distance.
Often, yes. It gets framed as objectivity. Detachment equals neutrality in that view.
And language plays a big role too, right? The article mentions the rhetoric of scientific prudence.
Yes, that's crucial. Using phrases like insufficient evidence or emerging consensus or safe pathways.
They sound reasonable on the surface.
They do. Very cautious, very prudent. But they can be used to subtly narrow what counts as valid data, to exclude other forms of knowing.
Like lived experience again?
Precisely. And even seemingly positive terms like holistic care or clinical oversight. In practice, the article argues, these can translate into more delays, more gatekeeping, more hoops to jump through.
So neutrality isn't really neutral here. It's a performance.
That's the argument. It's performing neutrality to achieve a specific, often institutionally aligned end.
So Dr. Cass didn't invent this pattern, but her background and her detachment made her fit the mold perfectly.
That's the idea presented, yes.
Which brings us to the bigger pattern the article talks about, this cycle. From crisis to containment. Can you walk us through the steps?
Sure. It usually starts with some kind of perceived crisis. Something bubbles up.
Like the rising number of trans youth seeking support.
That's the Cass example. Or it could be, say, worries about reading scores in schools or failures in forensic science that come to light.
Okay, so a problem emerges.
Right. And the causes might be really complex, systemic. But institutions often focus on managing the perception of the crisis.
Not necessarily the root causes.
Often not. It can feel a bit like, kicking the can down the road. Manage the immediate pressure.
And the next step is commission a review.
Commission a neutral inquiry. And who they pick to lead it is absolutely key.
Like Dr. Cass. Someone trusted by the institution.
Exactly. Institutionally trusted, credentialed, professional, and usually quite distanced from the community actually affected.
That distance again, seen as objective.
It lends the whole process an air of impartiality. Think Cass for trans youth, or maybe a former chief schools inspector for a literacy review, or a senior judge for a forensics issue.
Okay. And what kind of report typically comes out of these inquiries?
Well, they often reframe the big, messy structural problems as technical issues.
Things that can be fixed with new guidelines.
New guidelines, new protocols, maybe a slightly different process. They tend to avoid digging into the lived experiences, the history, the patterns of exclusion that might be the real root of the problem.
So the report reinforces the system rather than challenging it.
In essence, yes. That's the argument. It smooths the edges but keeps the core structure intact.
And then these reports, even if they have flaws, get implemented quickly.
Often, yeah. They're treated as definitive as the evidence. The article points to how fast the Cass recommendations on puberty blockers were acted on in the UK.
Despite the methodological critiques we talked about.
Despite those critiques. And you see similar things, rapid policy shifts based on these kinds of reports in education, criminal justice, disability services.
And it gives policymakers cover, we're just following the evidence.
Exactly. It provides that veneer of evidence-based decision-making, potentially shielding them from deeper accountability.
And the final step in this cycle, the expert gets rewarded, dissent gets sidelined.
That's often the closing loop, yes. The expert might get an honor, like the peerage or appointments, media platforms.
Their alignment is framed as excellence.
While the critics, the trans advocates, the community researchers, the neurodivergent scholars in this case, they get dismissed.
Labeled as biased activists.
Often, yes. regardless of how valid their points are. So dissent isn't really engaged with, it's contained, it's managed.
So the article's core point here is that this whole process is about containment, not real reform. The report is a tool for that.
Precisely. A tool to manage dissent and keep the existing structures in place. And, as potentially seen with Dr. Cass, the expert can benefit while the underlying problems might persist.
Okay. And the article strongly argues this isn't just about the Cass review. It gives examples from totally different fields.
Yeah, it tries to show this as a recurring playbook.
Let's look at those. Forensic science. First, something about height estimation from CCTV.
Yes, a 2018 study by Malign and Bruce. It looked like a solid comparative analysis on the surface.
What?
But the author of the Substack piece, Dr. Hurricks, apparently pointed out major methodological flaws in subsequent letters to the editor. Things like poorly specified equipment,
Okay.
using software in ways it wasn't designed or validated for, lack of proper validation like test retest, no IRB approval even though it used human subjects.
IRB Institutional Review Board.
Yes, ethics approval, and even misapplied citations apparently.
Wow, that sounds like quite a list of problems. Fundamentally flawed.
That's the suggestion. Yet the article says this study is still widely cited.
And why does that matter?
Because it's become a kind of foundational text. It gets cited uncritically in later research, including research that's used to validate commercial forensic software.
Software used in actual courtrooms.
Potentially, yes. So you could have flawed science underpinning tools used in the justice system.
That is chilling, the potential impact.
It is. And the article notes there's no easy way to track how often that potentially shaky foundation has been relied upon in legal settings.
Okay, so that's forensics. What about education policy? It mentions the science of reading and send reviews.
Right. In education, the argument is that movements like the science of reading, while claiming to be based on cognitive science, can end up narrowing literacy teaching in ways that might disadvantage kids who are multilingual or neurodivergent. It becomes a kind of one-size-fits-all approach disguised as science.
And the send reviews. Special educational needs and disabilities.
Similar pattern alleged. They claim to tackle systemic barriers, but often, the article argues, they skirt around the really tough stuff.
Like funding cuts,
Yeah.
austerity.
Exactly. Or issues like racialized tracking in schools, or the problems with using behaviorist approaches on disabled kids. The reviews offer technical fixes, but maybe avoid the deep structural inequalities.
And briefly, child protection, criminal justice, same pattern. Reports lead to technical fixes, not structural accountability.
That's the argument. Reports like the Monroe Review on Child Safety, the Bichard Inquiry after the Soham murders, the McPherson Report on Institutional Racism in the Police.
All started because things went badly wrong.
Terribly wrong. Clear need for reform. But often the recommendations get boiled down to technical things, collect more data, increase surveillance, tweak management structures.
Instead of addressing the fundamental power dynamics or accountability issues.
Right. And sometimes, over time, these reports can even end up reinforcing the very systems they were meant to critique.
So across all these different areas,
The pattern repeats. Perceived problem, seemingly impartial report recommendations that basically prop up the system. Uncritical adoption.
right. So the big question is, why? Why does this pattern keep happening? Why do institutions fall back on this?
Well, the author argues it persists because, frankly, it works. It serves the primary goal of many large institutions, which is often stability, not radical change.
Maintaining the status quo.
Mm-hmm. These expert-led inquiries, they offer a performance of listening, they show that something is being done, they absorb public anger or pressure.
Like a pressure valve.
Exactly. It creates the appearance of action, maybe buys time, but without fundamentally shifting the power structures. It's an institutional reflex almost.
So it's really about managing dissent, not dismantling the hierarchies that might be causing the problems.
That seems to be the core argument. Institutions are often heavily invested in their own structures when challenges come, especially from marginalized groups.
The instinct isn't to hand over power.
No. The instinct is often to commission a review. It looks thorough, it looks objective, but the outcome can be shaped by who leads it, what questions get asked, and crucially,
What kinds of knowledge get excluded?
right. And as we talked about, lived experience, community knowledge that often gets pushed aside.
Framed as biased, anecdotal, activist.
Mm-hmm. While this detached clinical view is held up as objective gold standard.
So the review acts as a buffer, delays real action, sidesteps accountability.
That's the function described. It produces these reports, cited as evidence, even if they're flawed or harmful, and the expert who produced it can become a gatekeeper for future debate.
Okay. Now, the article brings in a really interesting personal angle from the author, Jimmy Horrocks, about being an autistic Gestalt language processor.
Yes, this is fascinating.
How does that way of processing things give a different insight here?
Dr. Horrocks explains their thinking isn't strictly linear, step by step. It's more relational, associative, like seeing patterns, connections, a whole picture at once.
Gestalt the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, kind of thing.
Sort of, yeah. So they say they sense the pattern of the cast review early on, not by analyzing every methodological detail initially,
By recognizing it.
by recognizing the echoes, the similarities to other situations, other systems they had observed. They use the phrase seeing the choreography, not just the individual dancers.
So a holistic, pattern-based understanding. It just felt familiar.
Exactly. The familiarity wasn't, oh, I've read this exact report before, but, I recognize these elements.
What elements?
The language of neutrality, the missing lived experience, the credentialed voice speaking from a distance, the overall function of the review being about stabilizing things.
Not disrupting them.
Right. And Horrocks argues this pattern recognition is itself a form of valid insight. It's pattern-driven, it's often emotionally attuned. You can sense when something feels off before you can fully articulate why in linear terms.
And this neurodivergent way of knowing, it's often dismissed, but the article argues it's powerful.
Very powerful. Dr. Horrocks makes the case that these ways of knowing aren't vague or imprecise. They're rigorous in their own way, embodied, relational.
And maybe particularly good at spotting these systemic patterns.
Especially patterns that rely on repetition, managing impressions, manipulating trust, that tendency to notice the unspoken, the loops, the things that don't quite add up.
That's not a flaw, it's a strength.
It's framed as a form of resistance, yeah, a different kind of clarity. And it shifts the questions you ask.
How so?
Instead of just, what did the cast review say? Or what were its flaws? You start asking, why this review? Why now? What purpose does it serve?
Deeper systemic questions.
Exactly. And the argument is, in a world where institutions might rely on confusion or plausible deniability, that kind of neurodivergent clarity is vital.
Okay, wow. That adds a whole other layer. So this has been a really deep dive. Let's try and summarize the key takeaways.
I think the main point is that the CAS review, according to this source, isn't just about gender healthcare. It's an example of a wider institutional pattern.
Using expert reports to look legitimate, manage dissent, and basically hold on to power.
Right. Often by championing a certain kind of neutral expertise and sidelining lived experience. And we see echoes of this across different sectors.
Forensics, education, justice.
And the expert involved might be rewarded while the underlying issues don't necessarily get fixed.
And it's crucial to remember, the article isn't necessarily pointing fingers at individuals as being intentionally malicious.
No, it's more about the function of expertise within these institutional systems that prioritize stability, sometimes over real transformation.
Understanding the mechanics of the system itself.
Exactly.
Okay, so our final provocative thought for you, the listener, building on this.
Consider how often we rely on these seemingly neutral expert reports to understand really complex issues.
And ask, who benefits from the narratives these reports create?
Yeah. Look for these patterns elsewhere, in the news you read, in policies being debated.
Because, as the source suggests, just being able to name the pattern.
That might be the first crucial step towards thinking about alternatives. Alternatives really grounded in people's lived experiences and genuine accountability.
Something to definitely chew on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.